It really is. We're also joined out here in the field, both commenting and giving us these live views. She'll be doing some tracking in just a little bit. Julia Bergeron. Julia, how's it going out there tonight? I know you were working a few issues there, but I'm glad that we're finally live.
Why, hello everybody. It is a PJ party night, a little bit foggy, but otherwise clear skies as the rocket gets up a little bit higher off that pad, and I cannot wait for this rocket to go so I can go to bed.
Absolutely. I mean, yeah, us on the East Coast, we are up a bit late, 2:30 in the morning right now here in along the US East Coast. So if anyone here's from Europe, I guess good morning and very early day for you as well. But again, we're just over 20 minutes out from a launch of another 23 Starlink satellites here on Falcon 9. We're already deep into the propellant loading of tonight's mission. And actually, we are just about to get into stage 2 liquid oxygen loading in about 4 minutes. So we have a few things to catch up on here, but real quick, I want to toss this over to you, Trevor. Trevor, what do we have actually? Hold that thought, Trevor, because we just got the T-minus 20-minute vent there going on this transporter. So I'm gonna spin that question back around and send it to you, Trevor. What is the T-minus 20-minute vent? What is that large white cloud we're seeing from the transporter right there? Let's just jump right on in.
Sure. So I'll go over this and we'll go a little bit over the mission. So the T-minus 20-minute event is just purging the lines ahead of liquid oxygen load, which will begin at about T-minus 16 minutes. So what this signifies is that RP1 load on the second stage has been completed, and now they are cooling down and making sure the liquid oxygen lines don't have any FOD in them or whatever for when liquid oxygen load begins here in a few minutes. So now wrapping back around to your initial question, Ian, what are we launching tonight? And as the name implies, and as I'm sure you could guess, the answer is more Starlink. Yay!
Yes.
Um, so tonight's launch will be sending 23 Starlink V2 mini satellites into a 285 by 293 kilometer orbit, which will be inclined 43 degrees. The satellites will spend the coming months raising their orbits into the 530 kilometer circular orbit. To get there, the second stage will conduct 2 burns, as fairly usual for these missions, with deployment roughly 1 hour and 5 minutes after launch. The first stage that's flying today is B1067-15. Yes, dash 15. This will be the 6th booster flying for a 15th time, and it'll actually be the quickest a booster has reached 15 flights, or the quickest turnaround between 14 and 15 flights at 39 days. The previous record was 42, so it's not a huge decrease, but still it shows that these newer boosters are able to get there a little bit quicker. The first stage following liftoff will attempt to land 601 kilometers downrange on SpaceX's drone ship, a shortfall of Gravitas, which was tugged downrange by Crosby's skipper. Then both fairing halves will be attempted to be recovered by SpaceX's multi-purpose recovery vessel Bob, which has been working a little bit of overtime as Doug underwent maintenance.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Trevor, for that overview of tonight's mission. We could see there some of the marine hazard zones. You could see on the left, on the right next to Florida, that is the kind of launch hazard zones, where that large orange oval-ish blob on the bottom right is both the booster and fairing recovery marine notice zones. So you can see Falcon 9 is going to skirt just north of the Bahamas here. This is the trajectory they've been following for, I think, basically all of the Group 6 missions. Starlink really likes to launch to the southeast, both to avoid overflying any air routes to the northeast coming from Europe, but also because the weather in the southeast tends to be a bit nicer than the weather in the northeast when you launch out of Florida. So that's what we're looking at tonight for in terms of trajectory. And something else I want to look at real quick is the amount of support that we've gotten. I'd like to say thank you to a lot of people here. First off, Musical Wolves has super chatted $5 here saying today is their mom's birthday and hopefully this candle launches well. To Musical Wolves' mother, happy birthday. Hope this is a very nice candle for your big day today.
Aren't there technically 9 candles?
Trevor, aren't there technically 10 candles?
Yeah, sure.
I
Yeah, but
rest my case.
not firing at once. This isn't Starship hot staging.
That's very true. I hope we don't see any hot staging today. Ian Tibbetts here. I love the name. First off, with a $10 Australian super chat saying bacon ordered and bacon delivered. Go NSF. Well, sounds like you are in for a great, well, it's Australia, so a great afternoon, evening. I'm not really sure what the time scale is there, but sounds like you're in for a good time there. Thank you, Ian. We appreciate that. And again, great name there. Bideford here with a $30 super chat saying, if for some reason they blink and don't open their eyes because they've fallen asleep, here's a starter fund for all of you working tonight at NSF. And thank you, Bideford. Glad to see we're not the only ones here who are, struggling through the late night. So hope you can stay awake and see a launch here in just under 16 minutes. And lastly but not least here, Musical Wolves with another $5 super chat saying, glad this looks like it'll be launching on their mom's birthday. Well, once again, happy birthday to Musical Wolves' mother, and to Musical Wolves, thank you for the constant support that you've been giving. It is genuinely, genuinely appreciated. It's always great to see you there in chat. Also, one last thing, we have a gifted Red Team membership from Bleshy Boy, another regular I've seen in the chat here. And Thomas Connolly has become a Capcom member. So thank you to the both of you there for interacting in our membership program, which is a great way to get some awesome benefits, behind the scenes videos. And if you get Capcom tier or higher, you get access to our members Discord. So a lot of cool things coming there. All right, Trevor, so we have passed under T-minus 16 minutes, meaning that we are now into second stage liquid oxygen loading. I'm going to ask you a question here. This kind of goes off something you mentioned before. Mark here is asking, why does SpaceX launch the Starlink satellites into a roughly 250 kilometer altitude, and then they do the rest of the work to get to 500 or higher kilometers? Why don't they just send them straight into the operational orbit?
Yeah, that's a good question. And right, it ultimately comes down to SpaceX has to do some internal calculus where as they increase the amount of energy that they need to get into orbit, so that would correspond to being put into a higher orbit in this case, the fewer satellites they're able to launch. Additionally, the higher or the lower the orbit they put the satellites, and the more work the satellites need to do to raise their orbit into the operational orbit. So at some point, SpaceX has these curves intersect between these two things, where the orbit is high enough that they don't the Starlink satellites will be able to reach there quickly and not spend a ton of their propellant getting there, but also not so low that they re-enter or that they waste a lot of their propellant. So it's just this like weird intersection of curve that SpaceX has found that this roughly 290 kilometer orbit is best for inserting these Starlink satellites into.
Awesome. Thank you for that explanation there, Trevor. We have another question here from SRS or SR Stacy asking, when was the last Starlink launch? And they're commenting that they saw a bright train of Starlink satellites fly over just a couple hours in Texas. And I had to look this up real quick on Next Spaceflight, which is the best way to figure out when the next and most previous rocket launches happened. And the last Starlink launch was Group 7-7 that lifted off from SpaceX's pad at Vandenberg Space Force Base in California this past Monday. A very early morning launch. It was 5:30 a.m. Eastern time, which would have been 2:30 a.m. Pacific time. So SpaceX is out here loving their early launches no matter what coast they are on. Also, Trevor, we were discussing a little bit earlier about launch rate and how this vehicle has gone really quick between 14 and 15 missions, but Falcon 9 overall is looking at a really rapid schedule this year, and I think you had a little bit to discuss on what milestone they may be reaching this year based on how their pace is continuing to accelerate. So what's going on there, Trevor?
Yeah, so right, I think as everyone watching this stream in the middle of the night knows, SpaceX's launch cadence this year has just been insane. If you include Starship, tonight's launch is SpaceX's 88th of the year already. So 86 Falcon missions, and I think 4 or 5 of those have been Falcon Heavy. I don't actually remember off the top of my head. Anyway, so I was doing some analysis the other day after the Starship flight, and I realized that for basically the first time this year, SpaceX is projected to hit their 100 launch goal, if you make some assumptions that I'll go into here in a sec. So there are kind of two ways that you can go about this. The first way is look, right, we're about 89% of the way through the year, and this will be the 88th launch. So if you 88 divided by 0.89, you'll get that there should be roughly 99 launches this year, 98, 99, somewhere in there. However, that takes into or that doesn't take into account that SpaceX's launch cadence has gotten actually a decent amount quicker in the second half of this year, and especially the last quarter, than it did in the first quarter of this year, and the first half in general. So if you take that into account, right, SpaceX has launched, I believe, 27 times in the last 3 months now. So if you continue that pace out through the end of the year, through the rest of November and through December, they should just barely be able to hit their 100 launch goal, assuming you count Starship. And the other assumption there is that they don't have any large delays, like no time off during Thanksgiving or Christmas for launches, which we've seen SpaceX in the past. They have worked launches around those days anyway. So that said, throughout the rest of the year, right, we expect there to be, let me count, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 more Starlink missions. And then there's, of course, the South Korean SpySat launching at some point next week, and then USSF 52, and then perhaps another commercial mission somewhere in there. So this does require, after USSF 52, that there's a Starlink launch out of LC-39A for them to reach this goal. But to me, that seems quite likely, since they'll have plenty of time to turn around Pad 39A in December. So with all that said, it looks like, despite what we've been saying all year, that this goal seems very optimistic, SpaceX has a chance of hitting it, and if they don't hit the 100 launch goal, then they're going to be extraordinarily close, within 1 or 2 launches.
Awesome. That is great to hear, Trevor. And we're cycling through some of our cameras here. You can see, actually, on our previous view, our fleet cam out in Port Canaveral. It's pretty foggy out there in port. You guys see it right there. I believe there are some Falcon 9s in the view there somewhere. I can't see any right now. Again, we're looking through fog and a large boat in the way now. Excuse me. And Trevor, I actually want to follow on that. I don't want to keep making you talk, but there's something I really wanted to mention here. We were discussing a bit in our back channel earlier. In terms of increasing their launch rate, we know that the drone ships have really been kind of a limiting factor here, because it takes several days to bring the drone ship back, get the booster off of it, do any refurbishment work if you need to, and then send it back out. And SpaceX only has 2 of those on the East Coast and 1 on the West Coast. So how is SpaceX going to address that drone ship issue, specifically with Starlinks, in terms of decreasing their launch cadence even further?
Yeah, well, hopefully they're not decreasing the launch cadence.
Yes, decreasing their turnaround times even further. Let me correct myself.
Yeah, it's late. Yeah, so that's a really good question, and we actually have some exciting news at that point, because for some time we've been wondering, right, there are kind of 2 ways that SpaceX could go about this. The first is they get a 3rd drone ship for the West Coast, which seems somewhat unlikely, and then the second would be that they do RTLS Starlink missions, which also seems somewhat unlikely. So I was kind of conflicted of which way they were going to go. But the other day, in FCC permits for Starlink Group 6-35 and Starlink Group 6-36, we got FCC permits that allowed for an RTLS option for Starlink. So it seems like next year, SpaceX will increase their cadence more by having these RTLS Starlink missions. So how I envision this going, at least to start, is SpaceX will probably have 2 back-to-back missions from the Cape that land on drone ships, and then 1 that does RTLS. And then by the time the drone ships are ready again, they can do 2 back-to-back, so like 40 launches, and then 1 on 1 RTLS, and keep doing that. And then I imagine later in the year, when they want to continue increasing launch cadence, it is possible that they would alternate, like every other Starlink mission being RTLS. So I think the obvious question from there is how big of a payload restriction would this be? And the speculation is that it would probably be 14, 15, maybe 16 satellites. So they would still be able to launch quite a few Starlinks at a time, and they would be able to increase their cadence by an additional, roughly 30%. So it'll be interesting to see what SpaceX does.
Yeah, that's going to be exciting to see, especially like you mentioned, there's only one drone ship on the West Coast, so they're very limited in that regard, especially when Slick 6 comes online, which we don't have a date for, maybe next year, maybe 2025, but still they're very limited on their drone ship assets. And speaking of their drone ship assets, we have a live view here from our Fleet Cam camera. It's always live 24/7 on Space Coast Live, but you can see a Falcon 9 there on a drone ship that should be just read the instructions because a shortfall of gravitas is out at sea, I believe. So we have a Falcon 9 there that just came back. It's ready to be offloaded. There was another one just to the right here. I'm not sure if they got that horizontal already, but as of a few hours ago, there were 2 boosters vertical in port. So there is never a slow day at SpaceX fleet operations in Port Canaveral. And I'm sure, Julia, you can kind of lend a hand at that. How have fleet operations been out there at Port Canaveral as of late?
They've been really busy, but they're definitely into a rhythm. Most of the time, the drone ship comes in. There's often another booster still being finished processing, so they can empty the stand, move the next one on. That gives them enough time to do whatever refueling they may need, and then usually get out in about 24 hours. So it's kind of the back and forth that Port Canaveral had been looking for, and it's getting pretty smooth.
Yeah, I mean that's good for port traffic because in the end it gives Port Canaveral, more revenue and more docks being used. And real quickly before we kind of move into the last part of the countdown here, is there any space at Port Canaveral, at least in your opinion, where SpaceX could put a third drone ship if they need to, or is it completely jammed full right now?
Um, no, there would still be space. The north end of the cargo docks, that would work. Often it's really close to where the Coast Guard is docked right now, but the long-term plans for Port Canaveral actually move some more things around, like the tugs. So over time, there could be room for a third drone ship, and whatever vessel perhaps Blue Origin chooses.
Awesome,
Yeah,
very
I
cool. And
know.
go ahead, Trevor.
Not to interrupt, there was an interesting conversation, I believe it was probably about a year ago at this point, with the Cape Canaveral regarding a lot of these space companies talking about how not everyone can, have at port all the time drone ships and fairing recovery vessels and all of that. But then in the same paperwork, there was some comment made about how SpaceX isn't that big of a problem because their fleet is constantly at sea, which I always thought was kind of humorous.
Yeah, and I mean New Glenn is seemingly not going to be that high of a launch rate launch vehicle, at least not for a while, even in comparison to Falcon 9. So, yeah, you would imagine their port assets may be in port a little bit more often than SpaceX's are. But again, that's probably a year or two away until New Glenn starts getting into the reuse phase. But it's going to be a very exciting next year or two as we see Falcon 9 launch operations continue to expand. New Glenn comes online, a new pad comes online in Vandenberg. It's a great time for reusable rocketry as a whole. We're getting down into the last few minutes here of the countdown, coming up on T minus 3 minutes. Right now, the vehicle is going through final propellant loading the last bits of liquid oxygen. I was about to say liquid methane. Whew, I've had too much Starship on my mind. Liquid oxygen and RP1 onto the vehicle. I still see a little bit of venting happening here and there. That's going to begin to tail off as we get closer and closer to T0. Another thing that's going on right now, the strong back has leaned back by about 1.5 degrees just to give a little bit of initial separation, and then it will rapidly fall back right at liftoff. Another thing we're looking at right now is engine chill on the 9 first stage Merlin engines. That's not visible right now, but if you were able to look at those engines, you'd see a bit of small white gas coming out of the bottom. That's because they're beginning to slowly flow some liquid oxygen through those engine bells and the engine plumbing just to chill them down so they're not thermally shocked right at engine ignition. Now, coming up in the next minute or so in countdown at T minus 1 minute, the flight computers are going to take control of the vehicle and begin their final pre-launch checks. The propellant tanks are going to be fully pressurized to their flight pressure. We're going to see that venting begin to taper off on the vehicle. 15 seconds later, at T minus 45 seconds, SpaceX's launch director will give a go for launch. That's only if everything looks really good on the vehicle and they are ready to go tonight. From there, it's just going to be a little bit of last minute venting up until ignition. ignition, and liftoff. That's all about 50 seconds away from right now where we are. Brandon Meyer, real quick, has gifted 5 Red Team memberships. Thank you for your support there. And if anyone did get gifted memberships by Brandon there, be sure to thank them in chat because that's some great way of giving back to the community.
And we could see from that SpaceX angle, the fairing, at least one of the fairings on tonight's mission seems to be flight proven, which is expected at this point, as I believe at this point, my guess is over 95% of the payload fairings this year have been flight proven.
And that, I mean, we discussed boosters for quite a bit of this countdown, but that in itself is an extraordinary achievement and something that has absolutely never been done before. It's amazing how that's gone from, doubting it would ever happen to now it is a completely common thing.
Yeah, it was on the Starlink Group 6-26 mission. One of the fairing halves flew for the 13th time, which is the current flight record. And from that, we were able to back out the fairing turnaround time right now seems to be on the order of 50 days between flights, which is certainly a lot lower than it was at the start when it was about 200 days average.
Yeah, and that's incredible given the speeds they come back in and without an entry burn. But now we're getting into less than T-minus 30 seconds until liftoff. You can see some last-minute venting there from the strongback. That's going to taper off over the next few seconds. They're trying to get all of the gases and propellants out of the strongback to avoid it being flammable and ignited during launch. Now we're coming up here on T-minus 10 seconds. We're going to give you a great look here at liftoff, and then we're going to stay quiet as the launch audio comes in, and you get to enjoy the rumble all the way up until around max Q. Looks like we have engine ignition there, and liftoff. Falcon 9 carrying another 23 Starlink satellites into orbit. Vehicle has cleared the tower and will begin pitching downrange. And look, I love the lit up shot of the engine exhaust there. Now we're going to stand by for some launch audio here. Got some shots of it here from our assets out at the press site. And now we are seeing the vehicle begin to ascend and pitch downrange. Sounds like it's a little bit of an issue there with the launch audio. Now the next event in liftoff here is going to be max Q, or maximum dynamic pressure. That's going to come up at T plus 1 minute and 12 seconds. And that's when the vehicle's having the highest aerodynamic forces on it. Oh. Now we can hear that launch audio tapering off. Sorry about that, everyone. Sorry for talking over the launch exhaust sound there. Vehicles pass through max Q. Now coming up in less than a minute, we're going to get to first stage main engine cutoff. Those 9 Merlin 1D engines on the first stage will shut down at T plus 2 minutes and 26 seconds, followed quickly by stage separation and second stage engine ignition. Now, Trevor, this is one of my favorite parts of the liftoff because you get to see the amazing shots of the vehicle and the plume expanding as it gets higher in the atmosphere. It's just a beautiful color, beautiful shape. It's amazing to look at, and I love seeing this.
Yeah, and the thing that I always love to point out as we end near the end of this burn is with this shot, you can generally see that the engines are shut down in a staggered manner. So they shut them down in pairs to reduce transients on the vehicle. And it's generally, there was very obvious tonight actually that you could see the 4 separate shutdown events, that it's not all simultaneous. And now we should have stage separation.
And there we have it. Next, we're going to have second stage engine ignition, which you can see here on your screen. Now, coming up in a few seconds, we're going to have payload fairing separation. We discussed the payload fairings a few seconds ago before liftoff. Those protect the satellites during the early parts of launch, but now that the vehicle is approaching the vacuum of space, they don't need them anymore. So they're going to jettison them there in a few minutes, or sorry, a few seconds, and those will parachute down into the Atlantic Ocean. On the left side of your screen there, you can see the first stage deploying its grid fins, and I love seeing the second stage engine exhaust effects on those grid fins. You can see on the right there, fairing separation has occurred nominally, and the Starlink satellites are now exposed to the vacuum of space. And wow, we still got some tracking shot here from Julia. Excellent to see the second stage continuing downrange. Now we're going to get into a bit of a coast phase here for the next 3 minutes. The first stage is going to perform its entry burn at T plus 6 minutes and 11 seconds. That is going to lead then to the landing burn at just after T plus 8 minutes. Meanwhile, the second stage, which you can see on the right side of your screen here, that's going to continue burning up until T plus 8 minutes and 39 seconds. And Trevor, with the you mentioned the staggered first stage engine cutoff there. It's actually something I think we were discussing a few days ago. Is that when you have a reusable rocket like this, you really need to begin to take into account the loads over time that it's going to get on it. On a normal rocket, having your engine shut down at the same time isn't that bad. It's going to put some stress on your vehicle. But when you have a rocket flying, over a dozen, potentially dozens of times, like Falcon 9 cores do, you don't want to have any sustained wear on your vehicle multiple times because it can cause fatigue. So it's really neat to see them kind of adapting a very staggered shutdown there to lower overall pressures on the vehicle.
Yeah, and it is something that's also done on some expendable vehicles. Okay, I say expendable, but my first example, Shuttle also did it, and I believe Saturn V also did a slightly staggered startup sequence. And then it was very obvious for shutdown on Saturday's flight of Super Heavy, where you could see 5 engines shutting down at a time in the star pattern when they went into hot staging, which was awesome to see.
That was an exceptional sight, and as someone who loves propulsion as much as I do, that made me so happy to see all of them working together in harmony like that. And yeah, like you said, there's no better display of that than what we saw on Saturday. Now we're coming up here in just under a minute on the first stage entry burn. Now this is going to be a burn to not only slow down the first stage, but also to create a sort of makeshift heat shield around the vehicle. Now what it's going to do here is ignite 3 of its Merlin 1D engines, 3 engines in a row. It's going to do it in a staggered pattern, actually, like we were just discussing there, where the center engine will ignite, 2 outer engines, and then those will shut down again, leaving just a center engine before that too shuts down. Now, what that does is, like I said, it slows down the vehicle, but also it uses that engine exhaust as a sort of heat shield to keep the reentry heating away from the base of the rocket. It's a mechanism that NASA came up with for landing on Mars called supersonic retropropulsion. And don't worry, you don't need to memorize that. There will not be a quiz at the end of this live stream. Now we're coming up there on the entry burn. We can see an onboard shot on the left side there of the first stage. And we have engine ignition. Now this will last about 10 to 15 seconds here. We can see all 3 engines are burning now. Now one thing to keep an eye on after the entry burn shuts down is keep an eye on those grid fins. You may see a little bit of reentry heating on those fins depending on if the camera feed lasts long enough or not. That's one of my favorite parts of launch here, so keep an eye out on that first stage camera if we're lucky enough to keep a shot on it. Now on the right side of your screen, you can see the second stage engine continuing to burn. This is its first of 2 or 3 burns tonight. This first burn is going to set the Starlinks into a parking orbit, and about 50 minutes after liftoff, it will reignite to get them into their final deployment orbit. And then sometime after that, the engine will ignite for a 3rd time to deorbit itself and the second stage to prevent any orbital debris. And you can see a little bit of reentry heating there on the left side, not that much, but always neat to see that. First stage is rapidly slowing down as it gets into the thicker parts of the atmosphere. Now in about 30 seconds, we're going to get the center engine igniting on the first stage. This is going to slow it down for its landing aboard the drone ship, a shortfall of gravitas positioned in the Atlantic Ocean. We got a great shot there on the left of a overall map view showing the direction that the vehicle is pointing and where the 2 stages are right now. I always love seeing that, Trevor, because that reminds me of Kerbal Space Program. It's really neat to see that kind of applied in real life.
Yeah, I don't play KSP, but it's always a good feeling to watch those lines slowly uniformly converge onto one another. I guess it's probably not uniform convergence, probably point-wise, but I will not go into math. And there's the landing burn. Ooh, I love watching the ocean slowly glow.
Yes.
And there is the 248th Falcon 9 booster landing and 174th consecutive. I got those two numbers backward.
Oh, that's great. That's an incredible milestone right there. There we go. We have second stage engine cutoff. Now those Starlinks and the second stage are injected into their parking orbit. Now for about 50 minutes, they're going to coast before reigniting the second stage engine for just a few seconds and to get them into their final deployment burn. But that's coming up in the future. Right now, we are going to end the stream right here because we are only looking at the liftoff tonight. On the right side of your screen, kind of through the haze, you can kind of see the crew access arm sticking up for pad 40 along with those blinking lights. And of course, on the left hand of the screen, the vehicle assembly building out at Kennedy Space Center. Always two great sights to see here. Now, we're going to cut that off here, so we'd like to thank you all for watching. We really appreciate you for tuning in here very late at night, at least if you're in the US here. And if you're in Europe or Asia, good morning or good afternoon. I've been your host for tonight, Ian Atkinson, editor with NASA Spaceflight. I've been joined out in the field by Julia. Julia, thank you for giving us those great tracking shots of liftoff and the commentary about as well.
Thank you for having me on stream with y'all. It was a beautiful view tonight.
Absolutely. Great tracking by you as always. And Trevor, thank you for joining me here in the studio on this late night.
Yeah, of course. It is truly crazy how easy SpaceX makes these missions look at this point. That this is their 88th launch of the year, and it's just crazy.
Exactly. These are numbers that you would not believe if someone told you them 10 years ago. We also had in the back studio we had Pat O'Laughlin in the back studio pushing the buttons, pulling the levers, and operating tonight's stream. So thank you, Patrick. We really appreciate that. And of course, we had Kevin as well and Alex giving us some fact supports in the back channel. So thank you to everyone for supporting the stream. Thank you to everyone for super chatting, liking, and even just watching. Have a great rest of your late night or morning, wherever you're watching from, and we will see you on the next launch live stream. Have a good one, everyone.
And here we go. We have liftoff. Propulsion continues to be normal.
R68 chamber pressure looks good.
Traveling up. Roger, planet.
Water power to fly! Yes!
Tango down to nominal. Flighting downside FD off. Bring in FD off. It's orange!
Orange 25! Oh my god! Oh my god!
Decollage. Put that in the big bag, Tango.
343 unfolds to go.
Indeed.
We rise together, back to the moon and beyond.
This methane will be igniting in the flare, correct?
Thanks. Keep red. Sure. We don't need any more of these.